calling their efforts to influence US policy on Ukraine clumsy and unconstructive. He says EU attempts to escalate the crisis have been clear. Lavrov insists security issues cannot be resolved without Russia, citing the 2022 Istanbul Agreement as an example of effective security guarantees. He praises the US administration for understanding the root causes of the Ukraine crisis and rejecting the continuing of war. Lavrov stresses any reliable security guarantee for Ukraine must include Russia at the table. Listen in to what the Russian foreign minister had to say.
Я уверен, что на Западе, прежде всего в Соединенных Штатах, прекрасно понимают, что всерьез обсуждать вопросы обеспечения безопасности без Российской Федерации – это утопия, это путь в никуда. Мы пока видим только достаточно агрессивное нагнетание обстановки, достаточно неуклюжие и, в общем-то, такие неэтичные попытки изменить позицию администрации Трампа и лично президента Соединенных Штатов, как мы это наблюдали во время сопровождения европейцами господина Зеленского в Вашингтон, вот, в понедельник на этой неделе, мы там не услышали никаких конструктивных идей из уст европейцев.
We're now joined by Ross Feingold, who's a political analyst, and he joins us from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, the world is reacting to those huge talks yesterday in the White House, where we saw President Zelensky and Donald Trump be much friendlier than they were before. Obviously, Zelensky had to bolster him, a plethora of European leaders by his side. However, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian top diplomat, has called these efforts from Europe's closest allies clumsy and unconstructive. What do you think he's talking about in particular?
He might be concerned about the possibility that the Europeans and even the United States are going to insist on some kind of buffer force, or we could call it a peacekeeping force, if some people prefer, that would be on the ground and possibly in the air as well. President Trump has already indicated a willingness on his part to provide air cover, but not troops on the ground, which he's going to put pressure on the Europeans to do. Obviously, the Russians don't want that. They don't want a buffer force between their military and the Ukrainian military. But one thing that the Russians need to understand is that this is not a dictating of terms by Russia, even though they have the advantage militarily on the ground at the moment. And it looks like President Trump is going to put pressure on Ukraine to accept the reality that parts of its territory are occupied by Russia. This is a negotiation, and it's very likely that part of that negotiation will include a multinational force separating the two militaries, and Russia really needs to accept that.
Ross, Sergei Lavrov has praised the US administration in his view of understanding the root causes of the Ukraine crisis. Do you think Donald Trump has done that from a Russian perspective?
I think this is just Russia trying to flatter President Trump. I really doubt that President Trump has spent a lot of time trying to understand the history of President Putin and his government's grievances with independent Ukraine, post-Soviet Union independent Ukraine. But that's a term that the Russian government and the Russian state-controlled media like to use. They like to say root causes, and they talk about things like Ukraine's moves to be part of NATO or to be part of the European Union. They've made these ridiculous accusations about the Ukrainian government being filled with Nazis and genocide against Russian speakers in the Donbass region. A lot of this is just simply not true. But Russia does say these things. And again, it's not a surprise that they're trying to flatter President Trump and say that he really understands the issues.
What do you think of Russia's approach, Ross, when it comes to insisting security issues which have been floated at these talks in Washington yesterday? Lavrov says that security issues cannot be resolved without Russia. Do you see them agreeing to any possible US security guarantees from Trump's administration?
They might have no choice. If they want the war to stop on terms that, frankly, are fairly advantageous to Russia in the sense that it might continue to occupy Ukrainian territory, then they're going to have to give in on some other points, such as a multinational buffer force and potentially some kind of security guarantee from Europe and or the United States that's provided to Ukraine. But if they want the fighting to stop, and keeping in mind the fighting is incredibly costly for Russia, both in terms of men and resources, cash. So they also have an incentive to stop. And there's an important thing here as well. And frankly, I don't think it's gotten the amount of media attention that it deserves in the past few days. Another thing that Russia desperately wants is partial or total removal of international economic sanctions, or specifically sanctions imposed by the United States and its European allies. So as part of a negotiation, Russia's going to have to give in on some points. They're not going to get everything that they want, and that's just the nature of negotiations.
Yes, Ross, do stay with us.